Sarah stood at the edge of the glass-walled conference room, her fingers tracing the cold, slick condensation on her water bottle, while her eyes scanned the room for a specific microscopic shift in the atmosphere. She was a master of the silent atmospheric shift, an expert in the invisible language of the modern office that most people were far too busy or too blunt notice in the frantic pace of 2026. When her CEO, Marcus, walked in with a sharp, clipped stride that barely cleared the industrial carpet, Sarah felt the familiar, painful tightening in her own solar plexus before he even reached his chair. She didn't need him to utter a single word to know that the morning's missed projections had already soured the air, turning the boardroom into a high-pressure chamber where everyone else was unknowingly holding their breath. To her colleagues, Sarah was the office whisperer, the one who could navigate Marcus's lightning bolt moods and sudden professional squalls with the practiced grace of a seasoned diplomat in a war zone. They called it her superpower, a testament to her high emotional intelligence and her uncanny, almost psychic ability to read a room long before a single PowerPoint slide was ever projected onto the wall. But as she sat down, unconsciously mirroring his rigid, defensive posture and adjusting her own breathing to match his shallow, rapid rhythm, Sarah wasn't actually practicing high-level leadership or social grace. She was engaging in a sophisticated, exhausting form of biological surveillance, a primal survival mechanism born from the desperate need to predict a volatile storm before it broke over her head. What Sarah didn't realize in that moment was that her empathy had been weaponized against her very soul, transformed into a radar system that kept her nervous system in a state of constant, low-level, agonizing panic. This is the hidden, dark cost of emotional intelligence in a toxic workplace, a psychological phenomenon we have come to identify as the empathy trap, where your greatest strength becomes your greatest liability. In a healthy, functional environment, your EQ is a bridge to deep human connection, but in a fractured and volatile one, it becomes a cage of hyper-vigilance that monitors for threats instead of opportunities. When you are hyper-attuned to a narcissistic or volatile leader, your brain isn't just processing social information for the sake of collaboration. It is absorbing the blunt force impact of their internal chaos. Sarah's mirror neurons, the very cells in the human brain designed to help us understand and relate to the experiences of others, were working overtime to simulate Marcus's internal toxicity within her own physical body. She told herself she was being resilient, but she was actually experiencing a profound phenomenon known as emotional contagion, where the unprocessed stress of another person becomes your own physiological and chemical reality. Science tells us that when we tune in to a toxic frequency with high sensitivity, our nervous system reacts with the same intensity as if we were the ones being hunted by a predator in the wild. Every single time Sarah anticipated a sarcastic comment, a cold shoulder, or a public shaming of a colleague, her adrenal glands flooded her system with a fresh, acrid wave of cortisol and adrenaline. These aren't just temporary, harmless spikes that dissipate when the meeting ends. In a toxic office, they become a chronic, toxic flood that slowly erodes the very foundations of your long-term physical and mental health. This biological tax is the ultimate hidden cost of the high EQ worker, a price paid in fragmented sleep, ruined digestion, and the long-term integrity of an immune system that never gets the signal to stand down. The tragedy of the empathy trap is that the most sensitive, capable, and self-aware employees are almost always the ones who pay the highest price for the dysfunction of the leadership above them. Because Sarah could feel the tension in the hallway so clearly, she felt a misplaced, heavy responsibility to diffuse it, acting as a human shock absorber for the entire team's collective anxiety and fear. She would stay 2 hours late just to smooth over the ruffled feathers of junior designers or spend half her day crafting perfect emails that wouldn't accidentally trigger Marcus's hair-trigger temper or ego. This is the seductive mirage of professional resilience, where we begin to mistake our tragic ability to endure emotional and psychological abuse for a high-level, desirable corporate skill set. Modern companies often reward this self-destructive behavior, rebranding the slow, painful erosion of a person's inner peace as grit, dedication, or being a quintessential team player who handles pressure well. But true grit is meant for overcoming external challenges and achieving shared goals. It was never intended to be used for the relentless daily endurance of a systematic assault on your psychological safety. By the time the sun began to set over the jagged city skyline, Sarah was far more than just tired. She was experiencing a profound and terrifying sense of self-betrayal that she couldn't quite put into words. She had spent so much of her vital life energy monitoring and managing Marcus's internal state that she had completely lost touch with the signals, needs, and boundaries of her own physical and emotional being. This is the ultimate, final evolution of the empathy trap, where hyper-attunement to the moods of others leads to a complete and devastating alienation from the core of the self. When you spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, predicting someone else's internal weather, you eventually forget how it feels to simply stand in the sun of your own uncomplicated existence. The high EQ that once allowed Sarah to build deep, meaningful relationships and foster community was now being used solely to manage the fragile, bloated ego of a professional predator. She was effectively using her greatest human gift to build a high-tech prison for her own mind, ensuring that she was never truly off duty, even when she walked out of the office doors. Even at a quiet dinner with her closest friends, Sarah would find herself reflexively scanning their faces for the slightest hint of disapproval or boredom, her brain unable to deactivate the threat radar. The trauma of the toxic workplace had fundamentally rewired her empathy into a defensive, jagged shield that she no longer knew how to put down, even in the presence of people who loved her. We must expose how this state of hypervigilance triggers chronic cortisol spikes that mirror the neurological signatures of actual physical trauma within the delicate structures of the human brain. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for innovation, creativity, and complex logic, begins to dim and power down as the amygdala takes over the driver's seat of the consciousness. Sarah found it increasingly harder to come up with the brilliant, disruptive marketing strategies that had once defined her career and made her a rising star in the industry. Her precious cognitive bandwidth was being entirely consumed by the invisible, grueling labor of managing the office's emotional toxicity and keeping the peace among her panicked peers. This is exactly why the most aware and emotionally intelligent people in the office often feel like they are trapped in a state of slow motion, agonizing breakdown while others seem fine. They are carrying the psychological weight of the entire department's dysfunction, believing the lie that if they just empathize a little harder or listen a little better, the environment will change. But you cannot empathize a toxic system into health. You can only drown alongside it as you pour your own stability into a void that can never, ever be filled by your efforts. The empathy trap convinces you that your personal suffering is a noble form of service, making you the voluntary martyr of a broken corporate culture that will replace you in a week. Sarah began to realize with a jolt of horror that her ability to handle Marcus was actually signaling to the rest of the organization that his toxic behavior was manageable and therefore acceptable. By being the perfect, invisible buffer, she was inadvertently protecting the very person who was systematically destroying her mental health and the morale of everyone she cared about on her team. This realization is the first, most critical step toward breaking the cycle of the trap, but it is often the most painful and lonely one for an empathetic person to truly accept. It requires the brutal honesty of admitting that your superpower is currently being hijacked and used to facilitate your own slow-motion destruction and the silencing of your own needs. To escape the gravity of the trap, Sarah had to learn the sharp, necessary difference between healthy empathy and the self-destructive cycle of emotional enmeshment and mirroring. She had to learn to see Marcus's sudden outbursts and cold silences as a weather pattern she could observe from behind a thick, soundproof window, rather than standing out in the freezing rain. This shift from emotional mirroring to clinical detached shielding is an essential survival skill for anyone with a high EQ who finds themselves trapped in a low-safety, high-volatility environment. It means setting ironclad boundaries, not just with your physical time and your overflowing inbox, but with your precious, finite internal emotional resources and your mental focus. It means finally recognizing that someone else's lifelong inability to regulate their own primitive emotions is not a puzzle for you to solve or a burden for you to carry. Sarah started her journey of reclamation by practicing clinical observation, a psychological technique where she would mentally narrate Marcus's toxic behavior without allowing herself to feel the impact. In the middle of a meeting, she would silently tell herself, he is raising his voice because he feels a loss of control, rather than letting her own heart rate skyrocket in sympathetic fear. This simple act of naming the behavior created a small but vital space between his external toxicity and her own internal nervous system, a sanctuary where she could breathe. She had to stop mistaking her grueling, invisible emotional labor for a badge of professional honor or a sign of superior character, and start seeing it for the drain it truly was. True resilience is the wisdom and the courage to walk away from a building that is clearly on fire, not the tragic ability to sit comfortably in the flames while you turn to ash. As the weeks passed and she stopped mirroring the chaos, the heavy, suffocating fog began to lift from her mind, and Sarah reclaimed the massive amounts of energy she had been leaking. She realized with a start that her empathy was a precious, non-renewable resource that deserved to be protected, cherished, and invested only in people and systems that gave back in kind. The high-stakes internal conflict of the empathy trap is at its core a battle for the ownership of your own identity and your right to a calm, regulated inner life. Are you a leader who uses your empathy to empower others and build something beautiful? Or are you a survivor who uses it to hide from the shadows of a broken man? If you find yourself constantly reading the room just to ensure your own safety and peace of mind, it is time to take a hard, honest look at the true cost of that awareness. Your mental health is not a collateral damage variable to be traded for a title, a paycheck, or the hollow praise of a person who doesn't even respect their own humanity. The problem you didn't know you had is that your natural kindness and your ability to see the best in others is being used as a leash to keep you compliant and quiet. We must stop as a society glorifying the empathic worker, who is simply the person who burns out the fastest because they took on the weight of everyone else's unwashed laundry. We must start demanding and building work environments where empathy is met with psychological safety and mutual respect, not with exploitation and the demand for more labor. Sarah eventually handed in her resignation on a quiet Tuesday morning, not because she couldn't handle the heat anymore, but because she finally valued her own life too much to stay in the furnace. She walked out of that glass and steel cathedral with her EQ fully intact, but this time, for perhaps the first time in years, that powerful intelligence was directed entirely inward toward her own healing. She used her uncanny ability to read people to find a new team and a new mission, where her insights were valued as a contribution, not used as a protective shield for a tyrant. The counterintuitive truth that we must all face is that sometimes the most intelligent thing your emotions can do is tell you when an environment is fundamentally beyond saving. Don't let your high EQ become a weapon for your own destruction or a convenient tool for a toxic boss who will never appreciate the depth of the labor you are providing. The biology of hyper-attunement is a heavy, soul-crushing burden that no human being should ever be expected to carry in the name of a career or a quarterly goal. You are infinitely more than your ability to manage a narcissist's unpredictable moods or your capacity to keep a dysfunctional office from imploding under its own weight. You are more than a human shock absorber for a broken system's systemic failures and the emotional immaturity of those who happen to sit in the corner offices. It is time to take your empathy back from those who treat it like a weakness to be exploited and use it to build a life that doesn't require you to be on high alert. When we finally expose the mechanics of the empathy trap, we take the power away from the toxic environments that rely on our silence and our high-functioning compliance. We begin to see with clarity that true professional resilience is actually about the fierce integrity of our own boundaries and the protection of our inner peace above all else. Sarah's story isn't just about a woman leaving a bad job. It's about the radical reclamation of a human soul from the cold, unfeeling machinery of modern corporate burnout. It's about the deep, transformative understanding that your sensitivity is a rare gift to the world, not a vulnerability to be offered up on the altar of a toxic workplace. If you feel like you are currently drowning in the invisible, exhausting emotional labor of your office, know that you are not alone. You are not weak, and you are not failing. You are simply a highly capable person caught in a sophisticated trap that was specifically designed to catch the most conscientious and caring among us. Recognizing the iron bars of the trap is the only way to begin the process of stepping out of it and into a space where your lungs can finally expand fully again. The air outside the glass cathedral is much easier to breathe when you aren't constantly holding your breath to see which way the wind of someone else's ego is blowing. Your emotional intelligence is meant to be a light that guides your path and warms your relationships, not a lightning rod that draws the strikes of every storm in the vicinity. Protect that light with everything you have, because it is the core of who you are and the most valuable thing you will ever bring to any room you enter. The cost of staying in the empathy trap is far, far higher than the temporary cost of leaving it behind to find a place where you can truly flourish and be seen. As Sarah drove away from the office for the last time, she felt her heart rate finally settle into a steady, peaceful, and rhythmic beat that belonged only to her. She wasn't scanning the horizon for danger anymore. She was looking with clear eyes toward a future where she could finally be herself without the weight of Marcus's shadow. The empathy trap is a real and present danger in our modern world, but it is not a life sentence for those of us who feel the world deeply and clearly. It is a powerful call to action, to treat your own emotional and neurological health with the same rigor and respect you apply to your most ambitious professional goals. You deserve a workplace that respects the depth of your awareness rather than trying to drain it dry for the sake of a smoother meeting or a quieter hallway. Never forget that your empathy is a world-changing superpower, but it only works when it is practiced in a place and with people who actually deserve the gift of your presence. Break the cycle of hypervigilance today and start the long, beautiful journey of healing your nervous system and reclaiming the boundaries of your own emotional life. The world needs your empathy now more than ever, but it needs you to be healthy, vibrant, and whole even more than it needs your labor or your quiet compliance. If this exploration of the hidden costs of the human mind resonated with you, subscribe to my channel Deep Mind Portal